Good afternoon, everyone. It is wonderful to have you here with us this afternoon. I am at Stellenbosch University in Stellenbosch, South Africa. My name is Mariki Olofsen. I am the manager of the Ubuntu Dialogues project here at Stellenbosch University, and I'm welcoming you on behalf of my colleague at Michigan State University, Upenyu Maji, and the two principal investigators, Bongani Ngijima at Stellenbosch University and Jamie Merson at Michigan State University. And we all welcome you here for the official start of our activities this year. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Ubuntu Dialogues project, these seminars, of which this is the first one for the year, is part of the Ubuntu Dialogues, and it's an Ubuntu an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation funded partnership between Stellenbosch University and Michigan State University. The partnership has the objective to transform the function and practice of the museum as an institution, both within Africa and around the world. We would like to establish new and strengthening existing connections between universities and communities, and develop a replicable framework for universities to become dynamic sites for the co-creation and dissemination of knowledge and practice. So this is a transnational dialogue, and it involves engagement among students, faculty, community partners in South Africa and the United States. And it has three main components: virtual student conversations, which we will have later this year, a student exchange program, and then this seminar program, of which this is the first webinar of the year. So we welcome you, and I want to introduce to you our two presenters this afternoon. Prof Mokolatsie and Jeanine Ntihirageza, and I am really looking forward to a wonderful, great conversation between the two of them. Chris has just completed a PhD in the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systematic Theology at the University of South Africa. He completed his master's degree in theology at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. His research interest is theological ethics, African ethics, and indigenous African religions. He is originally from Lesotho and currently lives in the UK, where he works in local government. He has also worked in different sectors in the UK and South Africa, including at in the non-profit sector, higher education, and in the print media journalism, where he was a reporter and an editor. Jeanine Ntihirageza has a PhD in linguistics from the University of Chicago. While on a Fulbright scholarship, she obtained an MA in applied linguistics from Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Her research interests are in linguistics, language teaching, refugee studies, genocide, and human rights in Africa. She has published a number of refereed book chapters and journal articles, and has presented research and advocacy papers at numerous professional conferences and community events. In 2016-2017, she served on the local arrangements committee for the African Studies Association's annual meeting. She co-edited an anthology with Alfred Frankowski and Chilozona Eze on critical perspective on African genocide, memory, silence, and anti-Black political violence. Since 2013, she has been serving as the chair of the Genocide and Human Rights Research Group, an interdisciplinary team at Northeastern Illinois University, which has been organizing symposia on the subject for the last 7 years. In 2020, she has become the founding director of the Center for Genocide and Human Rights Research in Africa and the Diaspora. Dr. Richard Bender, who will be the respondent for this afternoon's webinar, He's a political philosopher interested in the complex interactions between religious and political agency. His passion lies in understanding what holds societies and body politics together. He studied law at the Independent University of Kigali, where he also taught criminal and constitutional law. The limitations of the legal as an interpretive framework of post-genocide Rwanda led Dr. Banda to undertake doctoral studies in religious philosophy and political life at the University of Manchester in the UK between 2008 and 2012. His research looked at the actions of committed and practicing religious faith in situations of extreme political violence. Dr. Bender teaches contextual and practical theology at LKH Theological College and Durham University. His postdoctoral research explores different tropes of the aftermath of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, in particular, intergenerational narratives, dialogues on guilt, shame, transformation and accountability, and transitional temporalities, and resistance and rescue as positive deviance. This afternoon's webinar has the overarching title of Inhabiting the Language of Relationships of Care. And this title comes from Jeanine's title, Ubuntu, an Indigenous Leadership Approach for Peace Building and Conflict Resolution, the Caring and Human Dynamics, and Chris's title, the Botho, the Essence of Character Formation in Sesotho Culture and a critique of Afro-communitarianism. I want to ask Jeanine to present first, but before her presentation, I just wanted to touch on a few administrative arrangements for this afternoon. Both presenters will have 20 minutes for their presentations. This will be followed by Dr. Bender, the respondent. He will have 10 minutes. I will then take questions from the audience for the presenters. If you would prefer to ask your question live, please indicate that when you post your question in the Q&A file. It is good to know who is here and talking with us, so feel free to introduce yourself in the chat file. Just to say that it will make it easier for us to track your questions if you post your questions in the Q&A file and keep your chatting for the chat file. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce to you Jeanine's, just to say a little bit about her work and then ask her to start her presentation. For improved human relationship, justice, and respect for human rights, it is critical to retool leadership approaches to magnify the caring and human definitional elements. Most leadership models and styles presented in academic or other professional settings seem to perpetuate the same relational issues, perhaps taking a slightly different form for years and centuries. I propose, and that is Jeanine speaking, to investigate an all-inclusive, humanistic, and bottom-up leadership approach founded on Ubuntu Principles that's essential to effective peace building, successful conflict resolution, and prevention of senseless killings in Africa, in the US, and all over the world. Professor Ntihirageza, we are looking forward to your presentation. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Usman. It is a great honor for me to be with you, to be part of these dialogues, and thank you for the beautiful introduction. I am hoping that at this time, I focus on actionable items. So while I'm still doing the research and digging deeper on this model of leadership, I'm hoping today to focus on actionable. What do we do? That's really what I wanted us to talk about, especially after listening to a number of people on the, in this forum. I'm hoping we can, this will allow us to engage in a fruitful conversation. So again, as Marita said, I am, my focus is on Ubuntu and leadership, but within peace building and conflict resolution. But before I get into that, oh, I actually just realized I haven't shared with you. Okay, so. Right. Let's see if you can see. Yes. Okay. So as a linguist, I can't help myself point out that there are more than 2,000 languages in Africa and 8,000 dialects in 54 countries. This matters because, as science says, as experts say, the more languages you speak, the smarter you are. So if we are smart, because we are all multilingual, if we are that smart, why in the world are we still going to fetch for methodologies in the West, methodologies for teaching, methodologies for research? Why, if we're that smart? Because yes, we are very smart. Africans, multilinguals are smart. That's not linguists saying it. It's scientists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, they all say it. Anyway, I'll come back to this later. So I'll first talk briefly about Burundi and Congo and Rwanda. I'll link these three countries together, but talking mostly on the extremes, Burundi and Congo. And then I'll contextualize Ubuntu concept, which I am sure many of you already know about. I won't spend much time defining it, but I'd like to couch it, to put it in context here. And then I will present the model I'm discussing, and then talk mostly about how to cultivate it, how to nurture the model, and with a few insights and recommendations. Okay, so Ubuntu. Well, I don't know if you knew, more than 310 million people speak Bantu languages. Yes, in this region of more than 500 languages, more than about 310 million people. Think about that. And guess what we share? I'll get to that. So during the wave, so the movement from northwest of Africa, where Bantu speaking people moved from, they spread downward. And as in linguistics, we say, the more distance and the more time you spend away from each other, the more difference in your languages, in your cultures, okay? But what's really interesting, so diachronically, synchronically, we're supposed to be different among these 500, and we are, right? Among the 500 languages spoken and the cultures attached to them, we are different. But guess what still connects us all? And as we do research, we'll find that from country to country, in all this Central Southern Africa, you find that this tapestry, this fabric of Ubuntu didn't change much. It's truly amazing if you think about it. So we've changed, we dress differently, we do hair differently, we eat differently, we do so many things that are different, but the Ubuntu, the fabric that connects us for years and years, 4,000, 5,000 years, and we still have that tapestry, that cloth that connects us. Is truly amazing. So let's try to define it quickly. And I mean, we know many people, many of you in attendance know, it's about humanism, goodness, empathy, compassion, forgiveness, wisdom, generosity, hospitality, and unselfish kindness. And research has been done, as many of you know. So let's look at this. Look at how many have taken time to describe Ubuntu as a cohesive principle among the Bantu community. Respect, discipline, and good behavior, favors communalism, and promotes the human as a special moral being. Provides the basis for African ethics and morality, social ethic, with a reconciling vision for all of humanity, right? Code of trust, concentric harmony and harmonic unity, but mostly social ethic with a reconciling vision for all humanity. Think about that. Well, even in Burundi and Rwanda, we have all these sayings and the proverbs. I mean, I could give you like 100 right now with that talk about Ubuntu or that involve Ubuntu as a theme. And so one of them is umuntu n'uwundi. A person is defined by another person. Umwana si umwe. A child does not belong to one person. And we say this all the time because they are part of who we are. And babiri baja inama baruta umunani urasana. So 2 who are united are better than 8 who are shooting each other. So imagine we have this as a part of our lives, and yet we've been killing each other through genocide for years. What's wrong with this picture? So the next 2 slides are quite disturbing. So if you may choose to kind of turn off your screen, I mean, not watch for a few minutes, and then you can come back. So this is today, 2020, 2021, Burundi is finding lots of mass graves. In the past year or so, more than 4,000 mass graves. In one, they found 6,000 bodies. And this is from Hutus who were killed. More than 200,000 Hutus were killed in 1972. You see? These are people who have Ubuntu. In Congo, a name that surprisingly is not in households, King Leopold II managed to cause the killing of more than 10 million people between 1885 and 1908. Just think about that. And yet, not mentioned much. So what's wrong with this picture? Countries that had so much, I talked about the fabric, and yet they've suffered tremendously. So Burundi, Rwanda, and Congo share a couple of things. The borders, the genocide based on ethnic membership, refugees going back and forth between these countries, and then most importantly, the same colonizer, the colonialist, Belgium. And if I had another country that was colonized by Belgium to compare again with, maybe more than 5, 6, we would, but look at it these are the 3 countries that were colonized by Belgium, and we've been through divisions like never before. This was started long time ago. When they started the colonization of these countries, Belgium implemented divide and conquer. And I think there are two levels. If Britain implemented that policy, Belgium did something deeper that's unbelievable, that we're still living, experiencing the vestiges of Belgian colonization is so deep, runs so deep among us, among Burundians, Congolese, and Rwandans. It's unbelievable. Okay, so we blame the leaders, right? Absolutely, the leaders, whether it's directly or indirectly, it's the leaders. Again, we all have heard leadership matters, makes a difference. So the leaders who are authoritarian, self-centered, greedy, who lack empathy, who are lack integrity, who lack trust, and so on, they tend to cause trouble to their populations. Now, we still have the fabric that may be torn, but still there. So this was not like glass that shattered and we couldn't recover it. So we still have the bad leaders, but that are working in a space where there are Ubuntu principles. So what should we do? We have to rethink, we have to re-envision what would work in our communities, in our centers, in our countries, even across and even in the world. Why not? If the world has sold us so much, maybe it's time we sell them Ubuntu principles in research, in education, in business, in everything, especially leadership. So role models, do we have them? Oh, yes, we do. So this slide shows the various leaders that we've been blessed to have on the African continent. And these are not all. There are, of course, there are many, many more. But these, I thought, have some elements that King, I hope I say it correctly, Moshoeshoe, yeah, tried. Moshoeshoe, the first from Sesotho. Thanks, Chris, for these references. Very, very useful. Who said, "A chief is a chief by the grace of his people." And among the people that are in this slide, I feel they had an element of promoting the people before themselves. Through time, of course, there are controversies with some, but really, most of them had that. Mandela had that. Rwagasore in Burundi had that. Ndadaye, who got killed in 1993, had that, didn't run. They said, run. He said, no, 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 for my people, I have to stay here. And he got butchered. And that's actually the word. Anyway, so African leaders who succeed are servant leaders. That's really the key word here, servant leaders who are humble, who are respectful and humble themselves, who are relentless listeners, of everyone, bottom up, tree top, in between. They are listening, they are flexible, they are adaptable, they are patient. And we know, it takes time to make leaders, to create leaders. And that's, we still have, we don't have as many as we would wish we would have, but we hope things can change, right? So Severine Oteser, in her new book, just was talking about Somaliland, comparing it with Somalia. And she says, in Somaliland, the traditional system of governance was stronger and peace was built from the grassroots. People trusted the traditional leaders as compared to the warlords and the militias who are the younger or the ones who are using different kind of leadership skills. So people trusted the traditional ways, indigenous ways, and that matters. So Somaliland is, this is what Severin Oteser is arguing, that Somaliland is much more at peace than Somalia, because Somaliland was able to protect their indigenous ways, their indigenous traditional leadership. Okay, so so where and how do we get these kind of leaders? Since we still have the problem of colonial education, right? We haven't changed it. So I'll give you an example. So this young man, Rigi, at 13 years of age, he was among the lucky few to pass the national test to go to a boarding school, which was very, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, very prestigious to go to this missionary boarding school, right? Then he comes back on vacation in the summer, and he's invited to sit with the elders, but he is still a kid, 14-year-olds old by then. He starts making decisions with the elders about cases, about important issues of the community. And that's how things start going wrong when we lost our initiation processes for formal education, when collectivism was replaced by individualism from formal education. When these young men now, who are the leaders, who became the leaders, young men now and women, were trained to see themselves first. Remember the competition, remember the national test, remember the standardized test and all that? Me first, and then everybody else after, right? So that's problematic when we talk about leadership. So how do we cultivate and nurture this model that has to be comprehensive and bottom up and focuses on the human? Absolutely, it's the only way it can succeed. And so we have to make the Ubuntu principles a way of life, not something you find in a book only, not something you find inside the classroom, but something you find everywhere. So in our African family, the way it is, as big as all the relatives have to be involved, have to regain the value. Ubuntu has to be revalorized at all costs. And then the community, we have to involve community and all the agents in the community. We have to involve then the schools and all the agents related to the schools. That's how the Ubuntu focused, the Ubuntu-inspired servant leadership training will happen. It's the way we get these leaders that we wish for, that are not necessarily, they don't have to quit their school, their job. They can still pick up, just like everywhere else where we get infusion or in the curriculum, infusion in the way of life, infusion in the workplace. We infuse Ubuntu principles. It has to be almost like a consolidated effort, and it will take time for sure. So so we have to change a lot, right? So as it's been said countless times, one cannot do the same thing the same way again and again and expect different outcomes. So this, again, that's the formal saying. It's been attributed to Einstein, but it's been shown that he didn't say it, so I'm not going to give it to him. But we have to make sure our teaching methods and approaches are Ubuntu founded, follow Ubuntu principles. Our content. So when we say democratic, we went out there to learn about fair education, type of education, democratic education. We had it all along. And, but it was hidden. It wasn't published in books. It wasn't talked about because we were presented with a package of Eurocentric way of teaching and learning. Content has to be also based, has to be infused. If it's biology, chemistry, whatever it is that they are learning, Ubuntu principles should be part of it. In the books, at home, everywhere, the books we send home should be written using, they should have Ubuntu principles. Do I sound utopian? I know. but it's doable. If other communities, other countries, other societies have done it, we can do it too. And research methodology and approach, you've heard, recent, action participatory approach, research, and it's really, we've had it all along. That's how we always did. We observed and came up with the conclusions. So, but it wasn't, maybe for some cultures, it wasn't written, and but I'm not sure if it would have been accepted with the colonization. So we need a model such as this for improved human relationships, justice, and respect for human rights. It is critical to retool leadership approaches to magnify the caring and human definitional elements. And this model, when applied well, is essential to effective peace building, successful conflict resolution, and prevention of senseless killings in Africa, in the US, because that's where I am, and all over the world. So yes, we can get our own Ubuntu-inspired servant leaders if we work on it, if we are committed to that kind of investment. So we need it. We need them to build strong communities and promote inclusivity. We need it to build trust and empathy. We need it to safeguard human security. That's so direly needed. We need it to ensure dignity and respect, and we need it to nurture compassion and for individual and collective healing, so direly needed in so many places. To enhance, we need this kind of leadership. We need these leaders to enhance an environment conducive to collaboration. Servant leadership, Ubuntu inspired servant leadership. Okay. So a few insights and recommendations. So first and foremost, we need to change the way we think. So imagine today, in a hot climate, sweaty and all that, our lawyers still wear these wigs. And we have amazing clothes, we have amazing ways of doing it, but why are we wearing these wigs? So that's a tiny example, but that denotes and shows how we haven't changed. We still look at the West as the model of doing things. Yes, I know we have to make sure that our institutions model, are global, but we don't have to stick to some things that can be changed. So reality check. What is worth keeping in our curriculum? What is worth getting rid of? Let's revisit those vestiges of colonialism and get them out of our curriculum so that we can train our own, our youth, so they become the future leaders who are well trained. And we know it. I know when I meet someone from South Africa, someone from Kenya, someone from Sudan, Somalia, we all have this thing we share about the way we did things when we were growing up. And that was all embedded with Ubuntu. So we tend to value almost anything that carries a stamp from the West. Muzungu, everybody knows what's Muzungu. So we call, even food, we distinguish it from the Muzungu Amateke. I think, Richard, you will recognize this. We say this type of taro roots. Some are the Muzungu taro roots, and some are the regular Burundian taro roots. It's unbelievable that we've gotten to that point, right? So, but that's again, the kind of things we need to take out so we train our own the right way. Research and education. This has been researched. There's so much out there already. But again, we have, so it's an alternative to individualistic and utilitarian philosophies that tend to dominate in the West. Knowledge is interwoven into the same tapestry. So we know how to do participatory curriculum. We know how to do participatory research. It's all in us, but somehow we keep going out in the West, turning our hands, going like, show us, tell us how to do it. But we know it. We should be the ones showing the world what we've had all along. So in a research founded on Ubuntu, the research aims center on the agenda of the people and advocates for high participant engagement, not on the researcher. So it's not about me, research, look at me. No, it's about who you're working with, the participants, the subjects. And then, of course, participatory action research is already part of our Ubuntu principles. So we have an opportunity, by the way. So we already have the African Continental Free Trade Area that's been signed. So we should emulate them in education, in research, in way we're doing things that promote and train leaders. If this African Continental Free Trade Area has been signed and can function, maybe we need to train those who can work so that it succeeds. So support them, right? Okay, so here is a success story. Actually, this is the story that got me working on leadership in Ubuntu in the very beginning. So Dr. Mushi, I'm calling her Mushi, this is not the right name. She's Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And I watched her in meetings. I watched her walk around to go check on people at the university. It was amazing. She was committed, absolutely committed to bottom-up approach leadership. She was a determined decision. She would come with her own idea and she said, so there's this situation, what do you think? And we all in this, I was part of that leadership team, and we would be all brainstorming, and because she engaged us, right? So we'll be talking and talking. And then she sees that we're going like off, and she would just then goes, so have you considered this and that? And we go on and just talk, and we say, yes, and we continue, right? At the end, she went home with great ideas, with actionable items. It was amazing the way she would always engage us. She became the most popular dean and eventually became provost. But it's amazing how she made us feel so comfortable that we were safe. No infighting to get the best, the faculty member, to get the positions, it's inside academia where there's always politics, but that college was amazing when she was in charge. Okay, so that's just one example that marked me, and I had to see this person is, by the way, African and from Bantu speaking country. Okay, so when you run alone, you run fast. When you run together, you run far. Be human, be a servant leader. That we should all apply this. And by the way, the proverb is Zambian, it's a Zambian proverb. So make sure to give credit where it belongs. And that's it. Thank you very much. Okay, I think we don't do questions now.
Thank you very much, Professor Ntihirageza. Very thought-provoking. Thank you so much. I'm going to go immediately to Dr. Mokolatsie. His paper explores the understanding of the concept botho from a moral particularity and perspective of Sesotho-speaking cultures, with focus on the moral tradition and experience of the Basotho. And I'm going to ask Dr. Mokolatsie to start his presentation. And just for the sake of the audience, so our arrangement was that I'm switching my camera off, and when my camera comes back on, you have around 5 minutes to wrap up your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariki, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to be part of this interesting discussion. I'm just trying to see if I can find my screen to share with everybody. Okay. Okay. Right. I believe I should be able to be sharing with everybody. Thanks again for the invitation, and everybody who has come to this webinar. Your time is valuable, and the likes of us appreciate it very much. And we wouldn't want to give an impression that we deserve your time. And so some of us, we feel really honored. As it has been indicated, my name is Chris. I am original from Lesotho, and I am very interested in the subject of Ubuntu. Just some preliminary remarks to say that in this conversation, for now, you will notice that I don't speak very much about Ubuntu, simply because I'm a Mosotho and I speak Sesotho, and the equivalent word for Ubuntu, or the notion of Ubuntu that we have in Sesotho culture, is botho. So for much of the conversation with you today, I'll be talking about botho. And so one of my hopes is that from these conversations, we'll begin to look at the idea of discussing this concept with the idea of looking at the particularities of individual cultures. We have so far been discussing about it a bit more in general terms, but in each local context, it does take local nuances. So today I'm going to be sharing with you the perspective of the Basotho people. The overview of my presentation is I'm going to give you a bit background about Lesotho. Some of it has already been touched in the previous presentation, and try and relate the culture of Basotho to the current discourse around Ubuntu, and then look at the idea of reframing the discussions and the approaches to Ubuntu, how it should be approached, mainly using the Basotho culture as an entry point towards that conversation, and then share with you some insights about the Basotho understanding of botho as a central pillar of ethics in their culture. Particularly, if I'll be looking at some elements of the Basotho moral language and social practices, and then I'll finish up with conclusions. As we have already picked up from the previous presentation, Lesotho is one of the countries in Southern Africa. The culture of Basotho is one of the 3 Sesotho-speaking cultures in Southern Africa, the others being Setswana and Sepedi, both in Botswana and parts of South Africa, respectively. The language of the country called Lesotho is Sesotho, and the people are called Basotho. It's an enclave country for those of us who may not be familiar, with just a population of about 2.1 million. Historically, Lesotho is a country that has been, you could describe it as the embodiment of principles of botho, because it was an amalgamation of different tribes and clans put together by an amazing ethical leadership of one of the African leaders that already has been mentioned in the previous presentation. So today, the Basotho people occupy mainly the country that is known as Lesotho and parts of South Africa. The country and the culture is rich in ethical resources grounded on virtues and values of botho. This includes virtues and ideals around ethical leadership, as we have already seen in the previous presentation, that one of the virtues that the culture espouses is the idea of a leader being a leader by the virtue of the people that they lead. Helpfulness or mutual aid, which features quite frequently in the current Ubuntu discourse in the proverb "Motuki motuka batho ba bang," or its equivalent in Nguni proverb "Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu." It's again an expression of the virtue of being helpful to others, in opposition to the vice of being self-centered and selfish and looking after yourself. The culture is also rich in other values in terms of inclusiveness, and this is one of the ideas that is quite pertinent in today's context, where there are issues around lack of appreciation of migrants in other countries, or xenophobia in other contexts. And we have a proverb that really captures the values and the virtues that the Basotho culture espouses, which is Morwa is a Sesotho word for bushman. And basically the proverb is saying, don't say to a bushman, you bushman. Again, emphasizing the virtue of inclusiveness, bringing others into the fold. And of course, the most notable product from Lesotho is the idea of peace. Moshweshwe, the first is renowned for that, and it's one of the values that really the country and the culture can give us examples of how to build peace. And one of the ideas that it espouses is the idea of an object is far more valuable when used to thrash corn than to kill men on the battlefield. That is, you turn instruments of war into instruments of building peace. So those are some of the values that the culture and principles is built on. And the relevance of Basotho culture to the current discourse is that it is one of the cultures whose moral traditions espouse botho. And in terms of the current discourse, it is even more relevant because two key elements of the current discourse around botho is the notion of botho itself as a concept and practice. And as I indicated, the proverb, which means a person is a person through other people, or other translations is a person is a person because of other people. Those two ideas are quite central to the current discourse. And in Sesotho culture, that proverb is not just an isolated proverb, it's part of the narratives which are used as chief vehicles of moral education. And those two belong to the culture and language of Basotho people. So in that sense, the culture has got some insights that it can help us to learn some ideas around Ubuntu or botho. It therefore enables us to develop and understand the concept and deepen our current understanding. The section that I'm dealing with here around reframing the perspective and approach to analysis of it, it's really an implicit critique of Afro-communitarianism. This is an account of botho that is predominantly based on defining the concept in terms of the proverb that I've just cited. And it's currently the predominant approach, and in most literature on Ubuntu or botho, you'll find that this proverb is cited as the encapsulation of what botho means. From the perspective of Sesotho culture, there is another alternative, and that alternative is basically that a proverb like Motuki Motokabat and similar other ones that are currently being used in discourses around botho, and the principle or concept botho itself is not to be understood in isolation, but it is part of a moral scheme, and it is within that context. It is that moral scheme that gives it moral authority. But as we know that moral scheme or moral culture in many cases has suffered major disruption due to colonization, modernity, moral imperialism of the Western culture, and currently the technological culture. So from the perspective of Sesotho culture and my presentation, the way we approach this concept is it's really about looking at it in terms of like we are simply moral fragments. It is just a tiny window into the moral culture of these societies, and it is better if we can bear that in mind as we engage in the discussions, because it means for the concept to be fully intelligible, we need to understand that moral scheme. And in terms of the Sesotho culture, that moral scheme, one of the key features of it is that it is character-centric in orientation. Its emphasis and descriptions of the moral life is understood primarily in terms of development of good character. So as a result, you'll find that in Sesotho culture, botho is very much linked with ideas that denote character. The quality of the person's character is therefore what is regarded as most fundamental. And in this regard, the culture of Basotho and their ethics is consistent with African ethics as a character-based ethics. I guess what I would like to, because I know in seminars like this, sometimes people don't stay until the end because of the engagement. The real message that I want to put across is that when it comes to Sesotho culture and their understanding of botho, there are two key concepts that one you could take as a take home. Is the idea that botho is predominantly understood as a concept that defines personhood, what it means to be a botho person, and that this idea is intrinsically connected to another Sesotho notion of makhabane, virtues. And in Sesotho culture, as much as it is the case with African ethics. Virtues are always understood in opposition to certain vices that the individual is supposed to avoid. So that's the one take-home message that I would like to already put up front, even before I get into the depth of the Basotho understanding of the concept of botho. So in Sesotho culture, botho is very much understood in terms of it's something that an individual possesses, and you have to cultivate and work towards it. It is not something that we are just born with it. So as a moral concept, it is connected very much to the Basotho conception of what is a person. And motho, as I indicated in Sesotho culture, is very much defined in terms of good or bad character. Are you a person with good character or a person with bad character? And depending on where you are on that spectrum, you are assessed in terms of whether or not you've got qualities of both. And if we look at the Sesotho culture, there's strong evidence of this character-centric approach to ethics, and therefore their meaning and understanding of both. So if we look at the culture of Basotho in their language, a few things worth noting is that the word botho itself doesn't feature that much in the language of Basotho. So you would expect that as a key moral concept in most discussions and statements around moral assessment, the word itself would feature, but in Sesotho culture, it doesn't. And this is not different from other cultures where botho is not talked so much about. Rather, in Sesotho culture, you'll find that it is often implied in other expressions or certain words. So words like hasemotho, which features quite a lot in the current discourse, it implies both because it means it's not a person. It also features indirectly in words like botho, which is a description of conduct of a person that is regarded as not befitting one who is a person. It also features in words that denote character, like mekgwa, which means habit, or boitshwaro, which means, or it could be translated as behavior or conduct. But also, even more interesting in the Sesotho culture, it is linked with words that describe qualities of the heart, pelo. And this is not surprising because if we look into the language of Sesotho culture, you will find that we do not have equivalent words for what in the West we call ethics of morality. So as a result, moral assessment of conduct, in other words, evaluation of possession of both, is always connected to those words like to have a good heart, or to have good habits, or good behavior. And when you look at these words, when they are used to describe mode for a person, they are always descriptions of character. It is in that sense that in Sesotho culture, botho, as a description of personhood, is always linked with character. So when we go to some of these words, you'll find that like mekgwa and boitshwaro, the reason they are linked, or the justification for them denoting character, is that they denote habitual conduct. It is not just something that you do here and there, but something that you do as a matter of who you are as a person. It is for that reason that the Basotho notion of botho is linked to mekgwa, your habits, and boitshwaro, your conduct, and that defines what is the person. In this sense, you'll find that we find that in Sesotho culture, the notion of botho can therefore not be realized independently of the characters of the individuals that make it a reality, because it is in the encounter with the individual that you experience the value of botho in that particular community. And when we go deeper into the moral language of Basotho, you find that the words that they use to describe conduct, they are always related to either the heart, where there are descriptions that relate to character qualities. And the heart is regarded as the most true reflection of a person's heart. So if you have a good heart, you are a person with good character. If you have a bad heart, it means you are cruel, you are not kind. So all the qualities that are associated with a kind heart, you do not have those if you are regarded as somebody with a bad heart. The same applies with habits or mekgwa. If a Mosotho says to somebody that hana mekgwa, that meaning that that person is a mannerless person. It means that it is regarded as somebody with bad character, somebody who is not of good conduct, somebody whose conduct is unethical. The same applies with words like botho, behavior, and also diketo, or deeds. All these words link to the idea that a person, our actions and our words reflect who we are as an individual, and as our individuality in Sesotho culture manifests itself in our character. That is why in Sesotho culture, a person of bad character is simultaneously lacking in qualities of botho. This idea of character as an important component that defines what possession of botho is, we also find it in some of the social practices that the Basotho conduct, particularly those practices that are related to, or rituals that are related to key events in the life of an individual. So I'm going to share with you two of those. The first category deals with those rituals that deal with babies. So when a baby is born, there's a series of rituals that are done, which denote the Basotho understanding what they would like this person to be when they are adult. And these are called Cruelty rituals. This is a series of rituals that get done from when a baby is 1 year old. And the key one that I would like to share with you is one called Hufuwa, which means to give the child or introduce the child to solid food. And in this case, what the Basotho would do is that we look for a person in the community with outstanding character, somebody that has been regarded as the example of what it means to be a motho, or somebody that is deemed in the eyes of the community as the epitome of possession of botho. So this person would then be selected to be the person that leads the ceremony. And in the case of Hufuwa, or the swallowing of character, they would get a piece of meat and spit on it and then give it to the baby. The understanding is that the baby will swallow the meat, obviously, but like saliva of the adult, the child swallows the character of the person that gives them the meat. And the Basotho were so particular about this that various precaution measures would be undertaken to ensure that there is no chance that any other person other than that person first gives the baby the meat as a way of introducing the baby to solid food. And the understanding is that if by chance another person of bad character were to do that, then this child is going to grow up to become a person with bad character. And in that case, is regarded as somebody who doesn't possess botho. So this is one way in which the idea of botho as denoting good character manifested itself in the social practices of Basotho. The other area where we see the notion of botho linked to character and good character is with regard to lebollo, which is called initiation ceremonies. In Lesotho, we would rather call them initiation academies, because it was not just about circumcision. It was a lot more training in there. One of the key functions of lebollo or initiation academies is that it was a time for training in character. So the initiates that go to lebollo, the main aim is to ensure that they are given life lessons about being a good person, a person with good character. And one way in which this was done, because Basotho culture was a culture where education was done by example, is that all the instructors, Basuwe, in the at lebollo, were people that were regarded as basically paragons of virtue in the community. These were moral exemplars. And the reason they were chosen for such a role is that it was not only what they would be teaching during the initiation ceremony, which would last something from 3 to 6 months in the olden days, but it was also that these people would be individuals that the initiates already know from the community and would be able to relate their example to the lessons that are being given at lebollo. So this was a way of ensuring that the training in character of the individual can initiate, ensure that their understanding of possession of Ubuntu is not just something that you learn, but something that you need to integrate into your character as a person, and ensure that it becomes who you are when you leave the initiation school. In terms of the Basotho understanding of Botho, as I indicated earlier, one key notion that is important to bring into the conversation is the idea of Makgabane. Makgabane, like I indicated, denotes virtues, but virtues or Makgabane, it's something that you attain and you acquire and integrate into your character by habitual practice. So as a result, in Sesotho culture, it was quite important that individuals practice acts of Botho every day. So from small things as greeting adults when you meet them, from small things like helping adult people when they are carrying heavy loads without being asked. Those were things that were part of moral formation, development of character, and indeed developing a person into being a motho or a person. As a result, you find that in the moral language of Basotho, the primacy of character in their social practices, character is always emphasized as the most important moral consideration in what a person does. So Botho in Sesotho culture is not so much about right action or rules of right action as some of the discourse in the current discourse does, but it is always about determining what is good or bad character. Some of the essential elements around Makgabane in terms of understood in terms of virtues is that you cannot talk about Botho without thinking or simultaneously thinking about the vices that Botho is opposed to. So in the case of motho, a person, which means an individual who possesses Botho, you are always bearing in mind that the opposite is not to be a motho, as a motho. So in Sesotho culture, possession of Botho, in other words, to be a motho, always implies working very hard not to be the opposite of what a motho is, inculcating those values and virtues that are expected of a motho. And this we can also apply it to the proverb, "Motho ke motho ka batho," a person is a person through other people. The virtues that the proverb espouses is the virtue of being helpful to others. And the vice that that proverb is opposed to is the vice of boitshepo, which means selfishness or selfish pride. And in most Basotho narratives or proverbs, this idea of promoting of virtues and juxtaposing them with the vices is very much the theme that cut across. And in that sense, in Sesotho culture, a fuller understanding of what it means to possess Botho always implies an understanding of the corresponding vices. And those vices are expressed in terms of bad character as well. If I were to give you the final concluding remarks, is to say the current Botho discourse has largely not integrated the idea of virtues and vices in the discourse. And from the Sesotho perspective, this is one of the weaknesses. And this is where my critique of Afro-communitarianism is that all the values that Afro-communitarianism brings across as essential to possession of Botho, without understanding their corresponding vices, remains a little bit shallow. And in that sense, sometimes it becomes difficult to how do you apply this, because when you understand what you have to do, as well as what you are not supposed to do, it gives you a much bigger picture of what you would like to be in the future. The current Botho discourse predominantly approaches the concept, as I indicated, based on slogans. So Umuntu ngabantu, a person is a person through other people, or another common one is I am because we are. And from the Sesotho perspective, the starting point for Botho is inculcation of Makgabane, virtues. It is development of good character. It is only a Motho who has good character that is able to apply and implement all those communal values that Afro-communitarianism propagates in terms of its understanding of Botho. So in Sesotho culture, I have tried in this presentation to introduce an alternative perspective and approach. And that perspective is to say, Botho is a moral term that evaluates and assesses character. And character is a very important component of understanding possession of Botho. It denotes inculcation of certain values and virtues. In the case of Sesotho culture, those are called Makgabane. It also implies development and character formation, which is where the idea of a family becomes an important component as a school of character. Today, the family is regarded as one of those social units that has lost a little bit of its moral voice. And from the perspective of Sesotho culture, is one of the social institutions that the understanding of Botho as found in Sesotho culture forces us to relook at the value of the family as a school for character. I'm hoping that through this conversation, I have managed to expand the current discourse beyond the current limits of defining Botho primarily in terms of current slogans that we are so used to. The idea of Makgabane, virtues, values, character development also enables us to expand the notion of Botho beyond its communal relations dimensions and make it a bit more personal by articulating the personal dimension of Botho. What does Botho mean at the personal level? It is only a Motho who regards themselves as a well-brought up individual who is able to appreciate those communal values that Botho implies. So by introducing the notion of virtues and vices, I'm hoping that this conversation will allow us to once again revisit Botho in terms of what are the virtues that Botho entails and what are the vices. And because sometimes the way of discussing and dialoguing, it is sometimes easier to understand a concept when you describe it by what it is not, instead of describing what it is. So far, I found that we have described Botho primarily in terms of communal relations, in terms of the ideal of belonging in a community, without articulating a little bit more what are the vices, because sometimes it is those vices that enable us to get that the message home. And in this case, those vices are vices around selfishness. Do you choose to be a person that is selfish, that is not helpful to others, that just looks after yourself? Or do you choose to become the kind of person that is regarded as somebody who is helpful to others, somebody who is kind to others? So in that sense, I hope that we will be in a position when we leave from these conversations to once again think about Botho in terms of, can it really be realized independently of the characters of the individuals that make it a reality? Can Botho become a reality if it is not something that speaks to the character of the individuals that are supposed to make it a living thing? Because it is in the encounter between me as an individual and you as another person that we experience Botho, that we experience those values that are so much underpin African culture. In that score, I would say, I hope that this is not the end of my engagement with this discussion. I would like in the future to look a little bit more on the idea of narratives or the narrative dimension of Botho, because the proverbs that we have highlighted in this presentation and in the previous presentation, they are just a tip of the iceberg. It is in looking at them as a body of knowledge that my hope is in the future I would bring this as another critique to current Botho discourse to say, there is so much that is embedded in those proverbs that we need to integrate them a little bit more in the current discourse around Botho, because proverbs, particularly in African cultures, such as that of the Basotho, they were the chief means of education and moral education. And at the moment, my concern with the current discourse is that we are discussing about botho, but the things that were used to articulate and illuminate this concept, much of those have not been brought into the discourse. And narratives is one example. In the case of Sesotho culture, I'm particularly thinking of narratives such as proverbs, or what is also called folktales, ditsomo, which are those morally freighted stories that would be told in the evening around the fire by grannies to young ones, which were, again, always juxtaposing the virtues and the vices, whether it's the story of an individual who was anti-social, an individual who was liking other people. So in short, that's my idea that I would like to share with yourself, to say, if there's anything to take from this conversation, is the idea of makhabane, virtues, botho, personhood. If you think of Sesotho culture and botho, you think of botho as denoting personhood, and personhood as something that is very much connected to development of good character. On that score, I would like to say thank you very much. I would be happy to take some questions or clarifications afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mokolatsie. And I'm going to give over to Dr. Richard Bender to respond to these two very provocative presentations immediately. Thank you, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Merit, and thank you very much, Chris and Jeanine, for such stimulating conversations as we try to inhabit this language of relationship of care. I really don't know how I can condense such rich presentation in 7-8 minutes, but I'm going to try to do so. And first of all, Jeanine, it was really interesting to see introduce us to this sort of nearly 400 million of Bantu who are characterized by this tapestry of fabric that connects all sub-Saharan Africans, sort of this humanism, this sort of cohesive code of trust, which has an undercurrent of a reconciling vision of humanity. And both of you interestingly use folk tales and folk's wisdom, whether it's Ritsomo or Imigani that Jeanine used. And as we're in linguistics, funny enough, Ritsomo is also Isomo, which is the learning, the process of learning, or course, or studying. And so, and that's what I think we're trying to do here. Jeanine asks a very pertinent question, really. It's looking at the political reality where all this sort of ethics of humanity and humanness collapse, and you end up with mass graves and dead people. And so she raised the question: if this Ubuntu has existed in our society, why do we have Burundi 1972? Why do we have Rwanda 1994? And why we have the Congo? The Congo is a secular thing, really. It's 100 years of calamity and atrocity. So how do we understand Ubuntu and atrocity? And then you take us into trying to look at ancestors or political ancestors who have exemplified this leadership of Ubuntu. And it's interesting that you mentioned Rwagasore. Rwagasore is very interesting to me. My father went to school with him. He was an indigent, a very poor boy. And he, until 1994, he had a pair of shorts that he has conserved like a museum item. And it was a gift to him by the prince when they were at school, from a person who was on the pinnacle of Burundi society to a Rwandan orphan who was also an immigrant studying at at one of the same lycée in Burundi. So these people, you give us a list of people who have exemplified this, and invites us to try and see how we can recapture this sort of leadership in a continent or sub-Saharan trope, which is a place of strife, of conflict, and of warfare, and actually needing peace. The approach, you give us an interesting approach, but what I have retained from your contribution, Jeanine, is this idea of trying to decolonize our systems of knowledge, and trying to unleash a model of knowing and leadership that is informed by the humanness of Ubuntu. And all along when you spoke, I kept thinking, but this Ubuntu concept is still very diffuse for me. You seem to suggest, to imply that it exists, it's formless, it is sweet, it is nice, it really is. It is Desmond Tutu-esque, and you think, well, but what is it? And I think that that's where Chris' contribution is really important, because it provides us with particularity or peculiarity, and takes us into a very particular space or trope or environment where we can actually begin to unpack and unpick the contours of Ubuntu by providing us a moral language out of which it emerges, by providing us with a cultural and social environment where this concept comes from. And I think it is very key, I think, to listen to Chris really, and the importance that has to be given to context and to peculiar context out of which the different understanding, the different languages and different grammars out of which concept emerge, because that is, I think it's out of that sort of peculiar particularities that we begin to see and to understand this kind of African system of values. And Chris, I'm amazed. I read and I really listened to your presentation with the same entranced. I was entranced when I was listening to the vocabularies and the words of this sort of intricate universe of complex relationships and dynamisms, where a person of character, motto, is formed, is given the mahabane, or the virtues which will turn him, or which will give him this sort of botho, or humanity, or a human person as a human should be in the Sesotho context. I think when we think about relationships, it's inevitable, relationship and care, it's inevitable that we have to think about heart, the site, the thing, the place where the human person, an African human person, is really found, not just in what they do, but in who they are as characters go. And you provide us with words that denote heart and habit. I love the idea of rituals that a sort of person from childhood swallow, they swallow, they absorb they absorb what it is to be human. And I think this obviously is going to be interesting to see how Jeanine responds in terms of pedagogy. How do we start learning this characteristic? How do we start learning? How do we actually begin? Where is the bottom up? Is it just from communities, or actually it's even from childhood, from pregnancy? Do we speak to our babies before they are born? Do we tell them the tales? Do we tell them the stories before they come to life? And the importance of Lebelong classes, sites of initiations, sites of knowledge, where we learn, where we absorb, where we swallow, and this universe, and which is guided by the basue. I like the basue, or the paragons of virtue, or the exemplars, the role models, the ancestors, however I want to call them, and how they are trained. So I think the important thing is realizing that Ubuntu is not something that falls from the sky. It is, from both of you, it's something that is acquired. It's something that we acquire. And the key to this really is what Chris called the concept of Sesotho, or humanist. And in conclusion, you sort of seem to imply that Ubuntu or botho is this ability of molding the natural human qualities that are expressed in Sesotho, which has both the biological human but also the moral human, and into a mortal person as a person should be, through a process of socialization and moral formation. And I think it is that mortal, that person, who might provide the leadership qualities that Jeanine has wished for. So, and as I listen to you both, so a few questions really popped up in my mind, and the first is obviously the common one, that we are at risk of romanticizing Ubuntu, romanticizing those traditional leadership qualities you were talking about, Jeanine, that we see in Mushweshwe and the others. We have, and especially you, Jeanine, because you are talking, you are bringing us in a post-colonial African landscape where this, obviously, these values were put to the test of political reality and were found wanting. So how do we avoid romanticizing them? And how do we, because they are not static. So Jeanine, Ubuntu is not static. It's shaped, reshaped by interaction with influences. And so how does it integrate? How does it plunder the Egyptian, to use the language of theologian, to reshape itself, to keep its core, but also be a value system that can actually inspire those people from whom we have been borrowing? So that's one question. And I have also been thinking about the whole Sesotho culture, the molding of the human. And my question was, is there a time when the person then is complete? Or are we constantly in a process of becoming? So there isn't really such a thing as a perfect Muntu. We are always in a process of becoming. Also, the thing is, the question really that maybe you both can answer, because it goes back to what I was saying about Jeanine, and it is, what happens with deviance? You know, how do we fail if there is this system of Lebelong, of exemplars, paragons of virtue, a system of narratives, and I like your idea, Chris, of using proverbs, tales, and other elements of traditional, as you define it. If they are when we fail to reach botho, when that process changes, where is the blame? Do we need to ascribe the blame? Is it society? Is it the individual? Is there anything in the Sesotho culture that tells us what happens when that process of becoming mortal fail, where the blame goes? Yeah, I will keep it to those three or four. You can share how you respond to them. But I want to thank you both for giving us really a window into an African society where there is a sense of how botho comes into being and how we can harness it to generate a contextual and continental leadership that is conducive to harmony, which I suppose is all the vocation of Ubuntu. But thank you very much to both of you for these tremendous contributions. Maricha, it's back to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We have quite a few questions from the audience, and I would like the audience to also engage with Dr. Mokolatsie and Professor Ntihirageza. So I want to ask if you could perhaps limit, Richard have asked quite a few questions, so maybe you could choose one or so question, and if we could really keep some tabs on the time. We have about 25 minutes for the questions, and we have 9 questions from the audience. So that leaves time for brief responses, if we can. And I also want to say that perhaps if people want to continue the conversation, if it's not answered satisfactorily, we would be happy to share the contact information of both Chris and Jeanine with you. But let's try and get through the questions. I'm going to ask, while Professor Ntihirageza and Dr. Mokolatsie is thinking about the question of Richard that they want to respond to, I'm going to very democratically start with those questions that as far as I can see, were posted first. And there were 2 in the chat file. So I'm going to share those with you to start with. And these are both from Baruti in Jacksonville, Florida. The first of his question is to Professor Ntihirageza. Let me just get to it. So he is asking, can Ubuntu substitute for a spiritual system? And in the same breath, how can Ubuntu then be applied in facilitating conflict resolution? And he is saying, Asante Sane. Thank you. The next question, also from Baruti in Jacksonville, is that is for you, Dr. Mokolatsie, and he's asking, in reference to botho, do you believe that the character exemplified by an individual is usually a reflection of rearing? Also, should one's presentation of himself or herself be consciously projected as a symbol of the larger community from which this person comes? So I think I'm going to leave you with these 2 and with 1 or 2 of Richard's questions, and then we can go to the next round.
So do you want me to go first, Chris?
Yeah, if you want to, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. All right, so really quickly, thank you so much for this great question, actually. Can Ubuntu be used as a spirituality system that can be maybe borrowed and implemented elsewhere? I tell you, spirituality is complex in its nature. If we look at the other spiritualities in the world, how they were promoted and sent out. And by the way, from an African point of view, spirituality is not something you don't recruit people into our spirituality. We are satisfied with. In fact, we let other spirituality types of spirituality come to us, and we're okay with that. So if you look in the history of different regions in Africa, we welcome them because we thought that was the way you do things. You keep your religion, you add one more, except that then those regions were imposed. But anyway, so you can use, so Ubuntu, it would take, I can see how some of the values, right, can be really put together. And this leads to also Richard's question of how, and also you too, about how inapplicable, how do we apply this in a conflict resolution or in other context? And really, it's about this again. I'm an educator, I'm a researcher, and the challenge to us, educators and researchers, is to really nail down the steps, the methodology, the methods, 1, 2, 3. We haven't had that chance to look at how it would work using what we know. So first we have to understand it, how it works, how it is now today with globalization, how will it fit in globalization, and then we nail down methodologies. I have a team at Northeastern University. We're proposing a course on Ubuntu methodology in research. We are putting together a curriculum. So we hope that's like one way. And there are others who have proposed, who have really, Bangura talked about Ubuntu Goji, right? So let's start slowly and build ways to implement steps, specific, doable, achievable, actionable steps. So thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to pick a few reply to Richard's questions and to, I think it's Baruti Katembo in Jacksonville, with regard to character and socialization of individuals. Richard, in terms of saying, are we not in danger or at risk of romanticizing botho? This is a question that often comes in discourses around African traditional culture and moral traditions. And I always find it interesting that when we discuss revisiting African virtues and moral systems, this question comes up. But when we discuss Aristotelian virtues and Aristotle ethics, this question of romanticizing the past is not brought up. So I can only say, I don't think we are. We are simply saying this is an ethical resource that needs to be reconfigured for today's context. If that was the case, I don't think virtue ethics modeled around Aristotle's ethics would still be something that we still feel strongly that it needs to be the kind of ethics that predominantly should be informing today's modern ethics. So in that sense, I would say I don't think it is. In terms of whether or not becoming botho or a person is a process that you can achieve in totality. No, because human beings, we are not perfect. That is why the notion of inculcating, it is a continuous process. When we are children, that process is predominantly led by the community around us, starting with our innermost community, our family, and then the village or the community which we live in, and then the society in which we live in. When we are adults, we are now supposed to take that baton from the community and then be part of actively involved in self-development of our character. So at that stage, the process continues, but it continues in a dynamic process whereby my character as an individual, while it is simultaneously being formed by the community I belong to, it is simultaneously contributing to forming that community. So the notion that our characters, we are locked into them and we can't escape, it should not come into the discourse. By virtue of having that inner agency as individuals, we are simultaneously forming and being formed by the communities that we live in. That is why, from the Sesotho perspective, emphasis is on the character of the individual. Not because it is something that the individual works on their own, no, but because it is through the individual internalization of the larger values of the community that they are able to transform the community. And that's how progress happens, both of the communities we belong to, but also of us as persons in terms of moral growth. You also asked around what happens when we fail to live up to the values of botho. Traditionally, and in traditional cultures like that of the Basotho, that failure did happen. That's why we have a concept like botho, which was the strongest moral sanction, short of sending somebody to jail, of saying, do live up to what is expected of you as a person. So because botho denotes conduct that is befitting of animals, yet it's being done by a human being. So in that sense, the moral sanction is meant to shame the individual to the extent that the individual changes their conduct and goes back to the principles and the roots of their cultural upbringing. In the extreme case that the person doesn't reform, it used to be the case that the person would be shunned out of the village and be kicked out of the village. But I think the idea of rehabilitation implied in botho, shaming you to giving you that the ultimate moral status that anybody that regards themselves as a well, properly brought up person would want to have, was meant to be enough to get the person to come back to living up to those principles. There was a question that Baruti Katembo, I think, asked around whether character is a result of rearing, and whether it's something that an individual, exemplified by the individual, is usually a reflection of rearing. Also, should one's presentation of himself or herself be consciously projected as a symbol of larger communities from which the person comes from? For sure, because in terms of botho, because as I've just explained, character development is a dynamic process, particularly when in adulthood, where as an individual, you are simultaneously involved in developing your character based on the principles and virtues of botho. But at the same time, the community is forming you. In many ways, as an individual botho, you are the embodiment of the values of the society from which you come from. I think one of the problems with modern ethics is the fact that as individuals, we very much regard ourselves as representation of our own ethic. We are not accountable to anybody but ourselves. Botho does not have that idea, and that's where a concept like or a reformulation of a proverb like "Motho ke motho ka batho" can be utilized as a form of a way of talking about moral accountability. So if we are saying we become persons through other people or other persons, the same should apply that even in the moral life, it cannot be that when it comes to the moral life, that principle doesn't apply. So in terms of the idea of botho, it is the fact that as an individual, you represent the moral culture from which you come from, the society from which you come from. So the notion of an individual living for themselves just doesn't exist. And I think that is one of the challenges that the idea of botho, as we are discussing it here, we are saying it should come back, because it is only when we have that sense of I represent a lot more than just myself, that the notion of consideration for the other becomes into play, to say the kind of conduct that I engage myself in, to what extent does it affect others? And this can apply to a whole range of things, not just in terms of the moral sphere, but it can apply into issues around climate change to say, you represent the larger global community, so you're not gonna conduct yourself in a way that contributes to climate change. So yes, I think to Baruti Katembo, it is the fact that it is part of rearing, because in Sesotho culture, botho is the end result of the process of fashioning those human qualities that we all have. And in Sesotho culture, those are called setho, humanness. We all have that in different cultures, whether you are born in Africa or in Europe, we've got that. But the manner in which each culture fashions those natural human traits that we have of feeling for one another differ depending on the culture that you are brought up in. That's why you find that in other cultures, kids are brought up to think of themselves primarily as individuals, whereas in other cultures, kids are brought up primarily to think of themselves as part of a collective. So, but all those, we are born with similar humane sensibilities and natural qualities. But the cultures that we are brought up in, they fashion those differently in us. And in Sesotho culture, the way those natural traits are fashioned by the culture is what we call botho.
Let's look at it. We shouldn't focus necessarily on stopping romanticization. Let's look at how we use it, because that's going to be the more specific we are in how we use it, the steps we use, the methodologies we use, that's going to clear. It becomes more manageable, more usable. Then it doesn't sound like romanticization. And after all, how did we learn about community learning, cooperative learning, and so on? There are so many things we learned outside, which were already in our own systems that we have a tradition. And we're not saying, I'm not saying go back to chieftaincy or storytelling, that's the only way we're going to learn. No. Bringing all the positive aspects together and build our own strategies. Okay, I'll stop here because I know there are other people who need to ask questions.
Thank you very much, Jeanine. Thank you. There are two questions from Suzanne Reis. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And I think Professor Ntihirageza has, now I'm battling to say Professor Ntihirageza has answered the first question. I'm going to read the question nevertheless. And if there is a way that Suzanne could communicate to me that it hasn't been answered, then we can pose it again. So the first question from Suzanne is, it seems that Ubuntu botho as moral schemes need to be re-established. What role do you see in scholarship and university teaching in that rebuilding? So I think, Jeanine, you have touched on that, but maybe not fully. And her second question is, in Western understandings, emotions are thought to be different from rationality. What are Ubuntu botho understandings of such a divide or such notions? Mm-hmm. So maybe, and then I'll go to the last two questions. I think they are, and I think I see that Dr. Motsumai Molefe, who is one of the new fellows on the South African side, wants to ask a question. I assume he would like to ask it live. So I will then go to Kieran Dr. Motsumai Molefe and Philip, if you.
Okay. All right. Chris, do you want to go first? Okay. That I can go. Yes. Okay. So thank you so much for these two questions, Suzanne. So the first one really requires, again, you nailed it. This is about scholarship and teaching in universities. Where are the materials mostly created? The teaching material, the books written, the research production, all of that. We need to start creating material small books for children that are absolutely geared to teaching Ubuntu, the different values, the different principles. And so books, training teachers. Here, when I hear touchy-feely, I was like, oh, come on. You cannot serve a person, but you don't chunk them and say, okay, now I want to dry, no emotions person, and now I'm going to serve the emotional person. No. We come as a whole. Remember, we hear many times holistic approach, right? That was the way we did it, right? I remember growing, all of us have stories growing up, what our parents did, our communities did. I remember, we don't have time, but I could tell you stories and stories of what we did. Someone is sick. They all, like a whole village, went to cultivate their land so that they are not behind on the planting season. They would wake up, so one family would be in charge of cooking, the other. So it was a holistic approach, not just like, okay, we're going to fix this problem because now you don't bring in emotions. We did not separate that way. And I think there is a way, even today, many approaches in the methodologies are going back to that, right? And especially if at the time of COVID, can you imagine if we didn't entertain emotions? What would we do with our students? What would we do with our colleagues if we don't entertain the emotions? So I know what you mean, because I've had colleagues like that. Look, you're being emotional. Yes, because I'm a human. So anyway, but that's just an exaggeration a little bit. But really, they come together. We wouldn't separate in an Ubuntu approach, Ubuntu-based approach.
I mean, I think, yeah, I can only say just that this idea of seeing the dichotomy or separating a human person into different spheres of life is again another conception of the self that I think we need to, particularly those of us who come from traditions where this is not common, we need to bring to the discourse. And the idea of Motho in Sesotho culture, that question doesn't arise of your intellect bit aspect of life, your rational, your emotional side. You are just a person. And so, and again, in terms of ethics and the morality of the Basotho, one of the implications of being a person with good character is being able to display the right kind of feelings expected of a human being as the situation calls. So if we are saying you are being emotional, you are not going to be able to express the humane feelings that Ubuntu principles demand when the circumstances where those feelings are expected. If somebody is crying and because you want to rein in your emotions, you're not going to respond accordingly, that's wrong. That would not be okay. So I can only say one of the contributions that conversations like this we need to bring is the idea that this notion of that has been taken away by contemporary ideas of personhood, where a person has got their private life and their public life, they've got their moral life and their social life, they've got their religious life. So a human life is dichotomized into various boxes. Within the traditions such as that of the Basotho, that doesn't exist, that doesn't arise. You are a person with everything that you are, from your social life, to your political life, to your moral life. So the idea that at some point the feelings might be an issue in terms of your expression of your moral agency would not just be something that arises.
Thank you very much, Chris. We unfortunately have very little time left. I'm going to just very quickly ask the question that Philip and Kuan Dartmoor asked, and I've asked Upenu to make contact with Dr. Molefe so that he could ask his question live. From Philip, it is, he says, Dr. Ntihirageza, thank you for your presentation. My name is Philip and I teach at Michigan State University. I agree that colonial vestiges, as you put it, continue to impede our mental progress, but is it not also true that some of our traditional vestiges remain obstacles in our realization of the Ubuntu philosophy of treating each other with dignity, with dignity. Examples are the past and continued poor treatment of girls and women in several societies, the high-handedness of patriarchal societies that created ruthless leaders like Shaka of the Zulus, and the pre-colonial intercultural divisiveness that Chinua Achebe identifies in his novel, Things Fall Apart. So that question is for you, Jeanine, and then for Chris, a question by Kieran Dartmoor. To what extent do you think the youth of today are less schooled in Ubuntu, considering that many initiation ceremony academies, Xhosa included, no longer offer long periods for training as you described earlier? Sometimes these ceremonies are only a month or even less in the cities today. Can we really be expecting these values to be well developed amongst your youth, our youth these days? And if we do get Dr. Molefe on live, I'm afraid these would be the questions we have time for today.
Okay. Thank you so much, Philip, for your question. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank
should I ask? Is Dr. Molefe here? Should I ask first or should?
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Molefe, yes, please ask the question.
Thanks, colleagues, for thought-provoking presentations. Very educational, very relevant. Just a few questions, just two questions from my side. The first question that I want to ask is a question about the presentation of Ubuntu that critiques emphasis on right action. That I find that to be both progressive and problematic. If we don't put emphasis on right action, but we put emphasis on habits, how do we know and how do we tell which habits are the correct one to form if we don't have a principle of right action? So that's the first question I wanted to ask. So it seems we need to think about a balance rather than rejecting one. That's the first question I wanted to throw. The second question I wanted to throw is a question about while the personal is important, what about the political? What is the space of the political? Let me give an example. Should we expect people who live in contexts that are characterized by great violence, by apartheid, by coloniality, to be able to achieve personhood? Right? So where do you draw the balance between the personal and the political? Where do you draw the balance? Because I think it's important to emphasize the personal. But I think the biggest problem that I think the discourses of Ubuntu are facing is we expect so much from individuals while they live in conditions that render it almost impossible for them to pursue the ideals of Ubuntu. So where do we draw the balance between the personal, access to education, access to public health, access to safe societies, access to social security, all of those things? If emphasis is on the personal, what about those resources individuals need to negotiate their lives? So those, I suppose, are two important questions I wanted to ask. If I can just sneak in one last question. And this is, I think it's a question that I think it's worth. Why must we care about the achievement of personhood or botho? In other words, as we are engaged in discourses of Ubuntu, we want people to develop right habits. There's a deeper question that we should ask ourselves objectively. Why must we care about that? What moral reasons could we, what's the basis for that? Why must we care about Ubuntu or botho in the first place? Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. Okay. All right. Chris, do you want to go first or should I go first?
Okay, no, I'll go first. That's fine. Thanks, Ntate Molefe, for your very problematic questions, but I'll try my best to attend to some of those. I think you're absolutely right that we should not make the idea of good character or to be mutually exclusive with right action. I guess the emphasis I was simply, or at least from the perspective where I am, I'm trying to highlight is that, yes, it's emphasis on right action. It needs to be complemented by the development of good character, because right action, it could be problematic because it risks being too rule-based. And I'll give you an example of what I think for me is a problem with and maybe your idea of the two should not be mutually exclusive. Right action would entail that I don't ask the question, what kind of person am I to behave in a particular way? The question I'm asking is, what does the rule say about this? So in terms of, let's say, for instance, stealing, it is an issue that we may have to address to say, what do you approach it from the perspective of right action? What is the rule that you follow? Or from the character-based perspective, you are saying, am I the kind of person that steals? Is that who I want to be? So in that sense, it builds on the ideals of the rules of what is right to do, but that is not the primary thing that is coming into the discourse. So in many ways, when one encounters a situation, your character in many ways predetermines the conduct you're gonna do. If you are predisposed to be, and again, I'm gonna use clumsily the example of being a thief. If you are predisposed to that, depending on what the circumstances are, you may say, I'm the kind of person that just want to, if I can't be seen, I'm gonna steal. But if you are the person that says, my character is so important that I want to be able to conduct myself, whether or not I'm breaking a rule, this is who I am. I guess that's where the idea of the good character comes in. The second question that you raised about the political, I think it's a very important component, and some of the colleagues have raised it in terms of making botho is not just a concept, but it's a political statement. I think as an individual that is espousing the values and virtues of botho, and I think in the context of South Africa, you could see it where there was the idea of preference for the poor. We wanted to side with the poor. We are the kind of people, our character is the kind of people that side with the poor. It causes individuals into mass mobilization, into action. You don't stand back against injustices. But the weakness with that is, like you're saying, for how long are we going to wait for individuals to change? And then when the situation politically isn't changing, it leads to the question of the kind of leadership that we have, the ethical leadership that should galvanize the resources in order to address those. You also asked about why must we care about this botho? And I guess some of us would say we care about it because we cannot avoid being moral. Whether or not we care about botho as an ethic, an ethos, and a way of life, there is another moral framework that we are using, and we are simply saying, is that moral framework adequate? And I guess the argument for friends of botho is that the current moral framework that we are using has got many weaknesses. Among those is ideas that it is too individualistic, that it is not enhancing fellow feeling of other people. So maybe if I were to sum up my answer to that last question, why should we care? Because we are moral beings by nature. So whether we are following the moral framework espoused by virtues of botho or by liberal values of modern ethics, we are operating within a moral framework of one form or another. And those of us who are friends of botho are saying, it's not just why should we care about botho? It's saying, why should we care about the current moral framework that is so flawed in many ways, at least from the perspective of those traditions where communal ideals are important, where sharing of resources is an important thing. If you think of examples like mafisa, which is loading of resources to other people who are in need. The current moral framework that is the predominant one today, that doesn't seem to engender those ideas. It seems to be propagating self-interest and progression of the individual. And those of us who care about botho are saying that is not the kind of moral framework that we would like to have as informing our society. So I hope I haven't gone too long on that, but those would be just some of my thoughts around the questions that Dr. Mokolatsie asked.
Okay, thank you. So if I may, Philip, if you allow me, let me start with Dr. Molefe's question and the two questions. Then I'll get to your questions so that I can connect with what Chris just said. So the idea of personal versus politics, I look at it first from what we get. I'll give you just one quick example. Someone was selling tomatoes and a gentleman went and said, I'll buy all your tomatoes so that you just go home. You don't need to stay here in the marketplace. And this gentleman turns around and says, oh, no. I can't give them all to you because so-and-so is coming soon. Didn't know when this one, but had to save some for this other person. He could have accepted all the money and just go home. But there was this idea of, I have to serve, to share with the other people, even if there was a risk that he could lose money, right? So this is just one example of when we care, so the politics will be cared by strengthening the community. So the individual with the character, the moral character that we're trying to do, we're hoping can develop and can be sustained, will help the community be stronger and fight. And two examples, Ijwi, an island in close to the part of DRC, and also the Somaliland people. Apparently, from what I read out there, and from I haven't been there, but they are becoming the model of peaceful communities. Why? Because it's bottom up. Like the community say, it's our community, we're going to fight for it, we're going to hold on to it. And again, applying these principles that keep them together. So they are able to fight militia together, they are able to fight this. So yes, it's totally, I mean, these are very good questions, areas of concern, but definitely if you solidify the personal, you solidify the community, and then hopefully you can fight, you can fight for resources, you can fight together for a way to get out of these problems you mentioned, you said, you listed. So again, thank you. This is a very good question. Again, this is why we're having Ubuntu dialogues, right? So we can hash these points. So about the, why should we care? Well, if we don't care, we are doomed to keep repeating it, being damaged as a continent. And well, I mean, let me speak for the area. We have tools we can use to survive, but if we don't use it, because this is natural to us. And immediately when you asked the question, Dr. Molefe, I thought about the elite versus ordinary people. And I thought, you know, imagine how much we could achieve if we went back into among the ordinary people and really build them up and help them see that there are tools that they have, because we've developed even just education by itself. I don't know if that's the case in many countries, but from what I know, just there's this individuality that's just focused on, and it's going to be a challenge to us, for all educators, research, and everybody else that's interested, to go back to school children, pupils, helping them see the group before the individual. And it's a challenge indeed, but I do believe we should care about Ubuntu because it's the most natural way that we find among the ordinary people in the villages, in the communities, local communities, and all the way up to the elite. They are the most natural to us. So why should we care about others who are imposing theirs? It's another kind of colonization. I mean, it's a globe in the name of globalization, but really, if you think about it, why the things we've been doing all along, can't we use them and let other people buy, get it from us, right? Okay. Anyway, so now, Philip, really quickly, about colonial vestiges versus traditional vestiges. You're absolutely right. There's no perfect system. All of them, wherever we will go, we find that there are pluses and minuses, advantages and disadvantages, and so on. So what do? Like I said earlier, we pull elements from each other, from each system and each system. Let's take the indigenous knowledge, the indigenous ways, epistemologies. Let's bring them with us. After all, we cannot not be global. There's no way. We're not going to go back to, as I said earlier, chieftaincy and all that. So let's take the positives from each of the systems and put them together and hopefully build something that works for us. Other cultures have done it, other societies have done it. Why not us? And I would stop there. But yes, you're right. There are horrible things that happen in those societies. Even if Ubuntu was there were still bad people. There were still people, rulers who want to dominate. Anyway, so I'll stop here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. We are already we are 11 minutes past 5, and we were supposed to end at 5 o'clock. I don't want to pressurize anybody in ending, but I know people have things to do. So unless there is a very urgent question from anybody, from someone, I think what we would commit ourselves to do is to put you in contact, to exchange contact details so that you please continue the conversation. And before I want to thank a few people, I want to also just put up a flag for the next webinar, which is on the 13th of April. And I want to ask you to please join us when Angela Tate, and she's also a fellow of this program, a PhD student in history at Northwestern University. And her topic is When Glamour Was African, Eton Merton Barnett and Race, Gender and Celebrity in the Black Freedom Struggle, 1945 to 1970. And responding to her will be Dr. Uhuru Falafala from the English department at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. So I think that will be also, like today's, a very provocative and engaging conversation. So with this, I want to thank first the presenters, Professor Ntihirageza. Now I'm struggling. Ntihirageza, Dr. Mokolatsie, and Dr. Benda, thank you very much for your work in putting together this afternoon's presentations and responding. For the audience, thank you very much for your engagement and for listening. To my colleague Upendu Maji for your support, and then for the administrative and the behind the scenes people, Nicole McKenzie, Mujadi Galiborwe at MSU, and Natasha Poltman and Alvandre Galant at Stellenbosch University. Thank you very much, and thank you all for a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.